Welcome, folks. We're just going to wait a minute till other people join us as well. Okay, maybe I will jump into the land acknowledgement. We are situated on Indigenous lands of many First Nations. This sacred land has been a site of human activity for over 15,000 years, serving as the home of Indigenous people and nations long before the colonial documentation of time. The territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations hold space for the daily activities of every settler that resides in the meeting place of Takaranto. As a reminder, we exist in connection to the One Dish, One Spoon Treaty, and as we learn from Indigenous teachings, it is our responsibility together to protect this land. As we discuss development and planning, we must recognize how these disciplines have been made exclusive and inaccessible, and how they've been weaponized against Indigenous people across Turtle Island. Within the context of social purpose real estate, we recognize both the opportunities and limitations of this form of development as we work towards reconciliation. Development for social purpose is not enough. It is an approach and a tool that can be used to make access to space more equitable, but there's so much work yet to be done to see land given back to Indigenous leadership and to see housing, community space, and social infrastructure as a human right. Thanks, everyone, and I'll pass it over to you, Alex.
So thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Welcome. So this is the first of 3 webinars that are part of the Roadmap Connect series, and we have one more next week and another one in the weeks following. So just a reminder that these sessions will actually be recorded, so feel free to turn off your cameras if you're not comfortable being recorded. These webinars also kick off a suite of training opportunities that will be launched in the upcoming months. So we have applications upcoming for our organizational readiness and accelerator programs that are part of the Roadmap Connect series, and we'll explain more about that as the session goes on, but those will be starting November 20th. So if you want to learn more about our collaboration between CP Planning and the Infrastructure Institute and how your organization can apply to these different programs, make sure to sign up to our newsletter, and I'll add the chat. I'll add the link in the chat below. And so just a bit about the Infrastructure Institute. So the Infrastructure Institute is a training, advisory, and interdisciplinary research hub at the University of Toronto School of Cities. Our vision is to build local and global expertise in planning for civil and social infrastructure, decision-making, and delivery. And so I'll pass it on to Cheryl to explain more about CP Planning and how this collaboration came to be.
Thank you, Alex. So this collaboration is part of our program, the Roadmap for Redevelopment Plans to Confront Systemic Racism. This is a multi-year project where we are working with community groups as well as with institutional groups like the Infrastructure Institute to build solidarity across racial communities to ensure that redevelopment includes affordable housing development and also that racialized groups are part of that economy of new development. So CP Planning, we are a nonprofit urban planning organizations that is practicing a human rights approach to community planning. Our guiding star is, of course, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, as well as case law and human rights legislation here in Ontario, as well as in Canada. So our work is deeply grounded in aligning public, nonprofit, and private sector organizations to invest in solutions that uphold the economic, social, and cultural rights of marginalized people to have access to good housing in particular, but that does include access to good jobs and an adequate standard of living, as well as opportunities for cultural expression. So it's the roadmap, as I had mentioned, right? So we're working with groups across different sectors and from community to institutions to government leaders. We're also in cities across Ontario. We're in Toronto, Hamilton, Peel region, York region, Kitchener-Waterloo, and Hamilton. So in today's session, we'll be talking about building and sustaining board buy-in, strategies for aligning leadership and engaging the community. So we have two wonderful speakers who will speak about their experience in building board buy-in and generating the board environment that is able to help sustain progress in from ideation to construction of new housing. So our first panelist is Joanna Rodriguez from Civic Action. And our second panelist is Diane Walter, the Executive Director of Margaret's Housing and Community Support Services. All right, so Joanna and Diane, I would love if we can just first start off with a bit of an introduction. So what brings you to the work of engaging board members in affordable housing development?
Well, for me, Cheryl, as you know, at Margaret's, we provide housing and supports to folks who are homeless, and our housing is gendered. So therefore, I must engage my board on a daily, if not monthly, if not yearly basis. So that brings me to it.
Yeah, for myself, I've spent most of my career either working with boards or working with organizations to support boards. Most recently, my work at Civic Action, I developed and launched a program called Board Shift, which is the goal there is to increase racialized voices on nonprofit boards. So a lot of this kind of board buy-in on lots of items, not specifically housing, but intercept is part of my work.
Mm-hmm. So from your experience, what are the unique perspectives that real estate professionals bring to these boards? Ooh, sorry, that was not, hold on. Sorry, can you share from your experience some effective strategies for building and sustaining board buy-in in affordable housing development, in particular to go from ideation to action, and then as cost continues to rise as you onboard more consultants to assist in the work?
Yeah, maybe I'll just, sorry, Diane, I think I'll just jump in first, just because mine's going to be much more general, I think, than yours. So like specifically my experience isn't in housing specifically, but I do believe that creating and sustaining board buy-in for any issue that has significant risk reward potential is very crucial. So I like to look at it from a more generic viewpoint. So what are the factors that play into building board buy-in and sustaining it? For me, it's influence, trust, and communication. So if we think about influence, like who has it, and how deep is it, that influence? So on a very superficial level, you can say people with authority, especially if you're looking at like a lot of nonprofits that are working in Western colonial systems. It's the board, it's the CEO, they have influence over the staff, the board has influence over the CEO, but that influence is easily broken if trust doesn't exist as well. So the flip side of this is that trust can really create influence for those who maybe don't have that power originally. And you can really cultivate this trust through honest communication and through following through on your actions. So if you're thinking about if you're looking at affordable housing, I think it's really important for the CEO to talk with the board and say, what is your understanding of this area already? If it's not something you work in, are they coming to it with excitement? Are they coming to it anxiously? And to kind of understand those feelings to begin with and to really listen to their answers. I think that if you come with a mindset of wanting to explain the why to the board of why you're wanting to do this, you're going to have that buy-in much more easily. And of course, also explaining if they're really excited right off the get-go, explaining that there is risk and outlining those risks so nothing becomes a surprise, and so that you're having those honest conversations the whole way through.
Fabulous. Thank you, Joanna. And Diane, from your experience, I know that you recently completed a major project, right? So what was the process in getting that accomplished?
So with respect to the question that you asked initially, Cheryl, with respect to buying and engaging boards, I think it starts on, thank you, Joanna, for your high level response. I certainly I'm in the trenches with boards, and in terms of buy-in, I think it starts out with the recruitment process and the onboarding process, and during the interview process, where you must be honest and you talk about the practicality of being on our board and some of the strategic initiatives that are planned for that agency, i.e., perhaps the building that we just completed. And I think Joanna talked about excitement, and you can see it. Are the prospective board member excited? Are they there because they're not there just because they want to pad their resume? They're there because they're truly excited and they want to add value to the organization. The challenge is, though, when boards go through a change of board members and tenure is up, how do you bring those new board members on in terms of sustaining that excitement, sustaining that buy-in? And what I've done in a practical level is that, for example, with the project that we had an expansion committee. And on that, the monthly agenda, we always go back to the expansion committee. Whether we talk about the expansion or not, we need to have it there so they experience it, they see it, it's kept alive in their consciousness. So if I have to talk about something with respect to the project, it's not, they haven't heard it. So to keep it alive and continue to talk about the project itself, the challenges, and on a daily basis, the board really isn't engaged in the practicality of bringing on a housing development, except when you have to get approval with respect to something that is new. So it's up to the ED or the CEO to keep the board engaged in having those conversations, not just when there's a board meeting, like perhaps reaching out to one board member that seemed really excited. So you keep that excitement going, and ultimately that board member may speak to another board member, creating some sort of a contagion of excitement and buy-in.
So it sounds like two key factors here are trust, like trust between the staff and the executive director and the board, but then also excitement, right? What are some other key qualities that you're looking for when you're recruiting or you're engaging with your board members for their support in affordable housing development projects?
For me, it's not even, it's not specifically to affordable housing. It's what are you looking for in any board member? And as Diane mentioned, excitement. So I think about passion for the mission and active listening. I think a lot of times when organizations are, especially nonprofits who don't have deep pockets sometimes to hire consultants and they rely on their board for a lot of things, a lot of times nonprofits think about, oh, we want a lawyer, we want an accountant on the board that's going to mitigate our risk, they're going to have all the answers. That's not true. They don't. And a lot of the time, the risk that they might mitigate might not be the risk that you're bringing forward. So for example, in affordable housing, if the community is not on side, a lawyer is not going to fill that gap. But if you have representation from the community, that's going to build a bridge into getting that community on side much more effectively than those hard skills. So I often think hard skills, nonprofits put way too much emphasis on hard skills, and that active listening and that passion, things that we don't have, courses for that very much, how to be an active listener. You can't go and get, a PhD in that. And it's so hard to cultivate and it's so hard to practice continuously. So if you find a board member who can do that well and is aligned with your mission, because of these board members, they're volunteer positions, they're not getting paid. So if they're not aligned with the mission, they're going to burn out, they're not going to care, and you're not going to have commitment. So those to me are much more important than any hard skill that you can find on a traditional resume.
Thanks, Joanna.
I think there are times that this question is not asked of board members. Do they have the time to commit to the mission? And if that question is not asked, I think it's really malpractice, because we've had board members who understood the mission and appeared to be committed to the mission, or they say they were committed to the mission, but we didn't ask, do you have the time to commit to the mission, to execute on the duties of being of a board member of this agency? And I learned this the hard way, but I've learned it, which is a good thing. And now I ask probably the first question, do you have the time to commit to serve on this board? And, you know, folks are genuinely seeking a board position, and they will have the time. So that is quite important. The board member must have the time to commit to the mission, and they must understand the mission. Working in at Margaret's, it's always good to also have some understanding of mental health issues and homelessness issues. They don't have to have the lived experience or the lived expertise, but they must understand what it means potentially to be homeless, or simpatico to that experience. I think, Joanna, you talked about some of those hard skills. I think those hard skills are important, but those soft skills are potentially even more important in terms of attributes that we're looking for in board members. You know, the financial competency, the understanding of the sector, it's wonderful and it's great. And you do ask those questions and potentially they understand it. But those soft skills around having the time and being empathetic to the mission is really terribly important as well.
Yeah, I'm going to double down on what Diane said as well. One thing I didn't mention, but I think we both covered a little bit in our answers, is that diversity of perspectives as well. If you have a board who all comes from the same sector and the same background, you're not going to be able to work through problems in an effective manner. You're going to be missing a whole, like, you'll have experts, you know, the lawyer will be in this little box and they'll be thinking of everything in this box, and the world is huge. You know, we have a whole atmosphere around that is missed. So if you can somehow connect the dots between all those pieces and have people in all of their own little different boxes coming together to bring solutions forward, it's going to be so much more effective. And what Diane said in terms of the time. So that's one thing when we were creating the boardship program, it was really important to us. And we specifically asked every organization. So the way the boardship worked is there's a pool of candidates and a pool of organizations who are basically trying to connect to each other. And so those organizations, when they post a board position, we ask them to say, how many hours a month does this person need to commit? And then we ask the same of candidates. Outline ahead of time, how much time do you have per month to do board work, so that hopefully you find that alignment from the get-go.
Yeah, it makes sense that alignment is key, so folks are aware of what they're getting into when they're signing up, and so that they can fully commit to, right? Because you don't want to be in a position where you're expecting someone to give 10 hours when they only have, let's say, 5. So just speaking on that matter, on that being able to be incompatible with the expectations and what is able to be delivered, looking at, you know, boards across Canada, oftentimes we'll see a lack of racialized communities on those boards. And so my question is, you know, in reflection of that, how do we ensure that these boards are able to respond to the needs and opportunities that exist within racialized communities to address the housing crisis? So if your board is not having enough racialized voices, is there a way to encourage that understanding around that perspective and movement to address those issues? Or are there other approaches to ensure that connection between the people who are leading the nonprofit organization and those who are needing support?
Well, Cheryl, what we've decided at Margaret's, that our board needs to be diverse. So we make sure that at least a third of our board members are of African descent, and then the rest are from various other racial communities. So we have that embedded. So we make sure that that's embedded, it's encoded, and therefore we must meet those pieces. And then obviously my voice carries as well as a leader of the organization. and my face, as you can see my face, right? You see what it looks like.
I agree with everything Diane said. I think there's no excuse anymore for any organization not to have a diverse board. A lot of times, you know, you hear people say, oh, I can't find anyone. I think that's laziness. I think that's lack of prioritizing this. If you look at Toronto, about 52% of Toronto's population is racialized. If you look at the makeup of nonprofit boards, only 16% of the board positions are held by a racialized person in Toronto. And if you go to look at Hamilton, that number drops down to 8%. This is nowhere near to representative. There are so many talented, diverse individuals within Toronto and Hamilton and outside of these regions as well. What ends up happening a lot of the time is that nonprofits often don't have the finances to do active recruitment and diversifying their candidate pools. And so there's a lot of shoulder tapping. So if we have a lot of white cis males on the board and you're going to shoulder tap, a lot of the time their networks are going to look a lot like them, and that's not going to solve the problem. So you need to think about some more creative ways. And what Diane had said about not just having that one member be diverse, you need to have more than that, because you're going to have issues of tokenization. That person's going to might feel like it's not a safe space for them. And also you might not be able to get other diverse voices on that board if they're looking at that board and saying, you know, they're not ready to welcome me. So we have to really move past diversity and into inclusion as well. As once we have those diverse members on the board, how do we keep them on there? How do we keep them engaged? How do we make sure that we're listening to them?
I think, Cheryl, it takes really strong leadership, and certainly Margaret's did not magically get to that place. It was sort of an evolution, and we got to that place after much arm wrestling and strong conversation and debates, and then we made sure that it was embedded in our process. It just doesn't appear magically. There has to be work by the organization leadership and the board as well in order to get to that place.
So how does one stay through that path of facilitating the addition of more racialized folks onto boards?
Well, for us, we've sort of encoded it that we need, and given the population that we
Like in the bylaw, or what do you mean by encoded? What does that mean?
Encoded, we've put it in our organizational bylaws, yes. That the breakdown of what the board structure and the board composition should look like.
And so that was agreed upon when the board at the time was
Well, I can tell you it was just not one conversation, and it did not happen overnight. It was an evolution. It was many conversations, many hard conversations over a period of time, and we got to that place.
So from your experience, Joanne, what are some of the resources that would be useful to support organizations in those transitions so they can perhaps have an easier time than they would otherwise?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a lot of organizations doing work in this space. I can speak to Civic Action specifically. So our boardship program, as I mentioned, we're trying to dispel the myth that there aren't racialized voices who are very talented and who can sit on these boards and be very, very efficient and intelligent and insights and all of that. So what we're really wanting to do is really create a network between the organizations and these candidates. And so at the same time, where I think most of the effort really needs to be done is on the organizational side. As I mentioned, in terms of making sure the atmosphere is inclusive. So part of the boardship program is we've created a an inclusivity charter with 8 commitments that all of our organizations have to sign to say what they are going to be doing to make sure they have inclusive spaces. Of course, a lot of these inclusivity charters, these pledges are very, very performative. They're signed, they're stuck at a door, they're forgotten. So kind of to help organizations make sure that they're committed to this continuously, and having conversations about this continuously, is we also have a governance toolkit. So our governance toolkit has plenty of resources, worksheets, articles, all of everything that connects our 8 commitments in our inclusivity charter to ways that organizations can activate these commitments. So of course, it takes the motivation on the organization side to do this. But if the organization is really committed to this, we serve it to them, so it becomes that much easier.
Amazing. And I would love if we can have those resources shared perhaps at the end of this session.
Yeah, I can link to the boardship program.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joanna. So, all right. So it's trust and it's passion and it's commitment and it's long conversation, that it's realizing that racialized people are out there and we're available and we want to support, and we can be members of boards. And so, we've talked a bit about the relationship between boards and leadership. So then when we go into the relationship between developing board buy-in to engage community and to ensure that we have the right community stakeholders in support of the project, in what ways can the board assist in establishing a supportive environment for new projects?
Can you repeat that, Cheryl?
So in what ways can boards help to establish a supportive environment for development projects? So that includes engaging with the local community. Maybe there's community members who would be against the development. Can boards support to generate support? Are there marginalized communities who may be overlooked? Are there ways that the board members can assist in ensuring those voices are centered? I'd love to hear if you have any stories on either of those example cases.
I think community engagement is key. I think that's what you're trying to get at, right, Cheryl, in terms of, so I think being honest with the community about what your project is and is not, what it is trying to solve for and what it is not going to solve for, is important. And I think board members, having presence of board members at some of those meetings and talking to community members goes a long way, especially if it's clear that the board members understand the landscape in which they are working.
I can actually give an example where a particular project, which you know well, Cheryl, the Winchester project, board members actually came to some of those community meetings as we faced it was astounded, a very aggressive pushback with respect to the project that we completed. So they became involved as well, like practically doing some of the walks with respect to engage in community members that were very much against the project itself. So sometimes they can actually physically engage in that process, which is sometimes helpful, sometimes. And in our instance, it was helpful because they knew the community, and some of the board members had affiliation with the communities that were pushing back on the development itself.
I see. So just being present in those spaces kind of sends a message, right? That there is broad support for what you're doing. It's not just.
And there are times when board members have affiliation in the communities that are pushing back. So that will soften the pushback from the affected community or the community that think they're being negatively affected.
Are there ways that board members have been able to bring in their professional communities to support the work as well?
Yeah, for me anyway, we had a architect on the board, and he was able to engage some of his colleagues who lived in the community to influence others in the community who were pushing back. So that was sort of a personal leverage of relationships. wasn't necessarily a board thing, but just an affiliation of members of the board who had affiliation in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to the importance of having a board that represents the communities in which you serve. Because hopefully if you have that representation from the get-go, you'll have those connections and you'll be able to leverage them the whole way through. But again, it goes back to making sure that person has time, because if they don't, then they're not going to activate those.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And that comes from when you're interviewing new board members. You very good, Joanna. You ask about time and you drill down, because if board members don't have the time, they're not going to be as effective, especially when it's a new project and you have to do community engagement, not over internet. You have to actually go into the community physically. So you need that time to actually go out and engage folks.
Mm-hmm. So my last question here is what before we go into Q&A, so if there's anyone in the audience who has a question, I see there are a couple of questions that have been seems to be sent to Alex and Helen. You can send your questions to Alex or Helen, or throw them in the chat. And I'll start to draw from the questions I'm seeing in the chat after this question. I do have backup questions as well, so we can always go back to those. But my question here is, what advice do you have for racialized leaders in the housing sector? You know, racialized nonprofits led by racialized folks who are trying to get into building affordable housing. What is your sage advice to them to develop board buy-in?
So sage advice to racialized leaders to build board buy-in.
Yeah.
Well, for me, I think a lot of the things that we talked about already, but on top of that is also just check in with yourself as well. I think anyone from an equity denied group, they're facing a lot more of mental load and barriers or biases than those who aren't part of those groups. So it's that whole idea of put your oxygen mask on first. You're not going to be able to support your staff. You're not going to be able to support the community or your project if you're not in a place that you feel supported as well. It's not easy. There's not like a one recipe solution to that. But that's what I would say.
Thanks, Joanna.
So I would say employ really good self-care. Have a great support system which you can bounce idea and do regular check-in kind of thing, right? Expect sort of the unexpected. Repeat that question again, Cheryl.
So what is your advice? What advice would you give to racialized leaders of nonprofits who are trying to generate board buy-in to get into affordable housing development?
As I said, good self-care, because it's a long, hard slog. Have a good support system in place. Recognize that housing development is very fraught. 5 steps forward, 10 steps backward. And don't get disillusioned, don't give up, continue moving. I think any project, I saw some information the other day that generally projects take 5 to 6 years to come to fruition. I'm not sure whether that is accurate, but I can speak to the Winchester project. We had sort of assess and came to the point where we said, oh, this will take 2 years or a year and a half. Then COVID hit. So of course, there was delays, and expect the unexpected. A 2-year project will take 4. There are money issues that can hit you. So expect the unexpected. Have a really good contingency plan, financial and social contingency plan from a practical perspective.
Oh, go ahead, Joanna.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna, one great organization who does a lot of support for EDs and CEOs of nonprofit is a group called Epic Leadership. And Epic is the point there is being an ED or a CEO of a nonprofit can be a very lonely space. You might not want to share everything with your staff, like your worries and your concerns. To a certain degree, being transparent, I think, is important, but also you don't want to worry them. And at the same time, you're not really in the same boat as the board either. So it can be really lonely. So what EPIC has done is they create a really safe, confidential space for EDs of nonprofits to come together to work through some of these problems and support each other through this work. So if there's someone here who's listening to this who is an ED of a nonprofit who needs to kind of bolster their support system, that could be a place to look.
Great, thanks for that resource, Joanna. All right, so I'm going to go now into the questions in the chat. So we have one question here. What are your thoughts on term limits for board members?
I love them. I think they're incredibly important. I would also add that you should stagger recruitment with those term limits, because you don't want everyone coming to the end of the term at once. Think about all the knowledge and all the onboarding all the knowledge that would be lost and all the onboarding that would have to happen simultaneously. I think term limits, while it can be hard to let go of a director that has been so beneficial to your organization, you're not going to get those new ideas, you're not going to get those new perspectives, and kind of the renewed and fresh passion sometimes if you don't have those term limits.
Mm.
I think term limits are, you can have an exceptional board member. However, that exceptional board member at some point will run out of good ideas. So absolutely term limits. And then folks can actually step off the board for X number of years and come back refreshed. You can actually burn out your board members and they need to be refreshed. Board limits are exceptionally important.
Yes, thanks for sharing that. I know some folks who are on boards and they've been there for a long time and the organization is not ready to let them go, but it sounds like it might be in their best interest. And so having a contingency plan, if you have your star board member, having a plan in place to find your next star, because they have to kind of go away and they may come back, but you have to be ready, right? That's what I'm hearing.
And that star board member can burn out, because I suspect that star board member is human. So he or she needs a rest to refresh and potentially come back.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. All right, so we have another question in the chat. Does that involvement project once the project is built and to oversee decision making? Sorry, I'm having trouble understanding. Does that level of involvement support board members in better understanding the project once? Okay, so does having board members a part of, I guess, community engagement and, doing the walks, as you noted, Diane, does that result in them having a better project understanding of the project? And how does that influence your decision-making around the management of that project?
For us, there were a couple board members. As you know, board members are diverse. There's some board members who have deep understanding and some board members you get on fabulously with and who you're simpatico with. For me, in real life, there's only one board member that was that involved. And that particular board member, I got on really great, and she had really great suggestions. So that worked well. I think the converse can be also true, where you have a board member who, and this is real, that you don't get on that well with and is not adding value to the project. But as it turns out, in my experience, in my instance, the one board member that was truly involved, even in some of the community engagement meetings, she really added value. And on a personal level, we also got on great. So that was a win in both boxes.
For me, so I agree with Diane. I also think that it's also impossible, though, for board members to be involved in every aspect of the project. They don't have time, they don't have capacity. And I also don't think they should be involved in every aspect either. So that's where it really comes down to having really clear roles and responsibilities for staff, the ED, and for the board. When you are bringing a board to a community, let's say like a focus group or a community engagement session, be clear with the board member what you are asking them at that session. Are you asking them to speak? Are you asking them to listen? Are you asking them to like plan a presentation? You know, it can be a variety of things. And I think it can get very murky and you can get a lot of frustrations if those roles aren't clearly defined, because then you might have board members overstepping, perhaps taking on duties that the staff should be doing, and then the staff, and they might not be doing it the way the staff would want to. So I think, yes, engagement and bringing them to those types of, bringing them into the project to get understanding of the why is important, but they shouldn't be doing the work, at least not if it's a governance board.
I think, yeah, absolutely, Joanna. There needs to be clear boundaries. I think there were some community engagement processes that we were involved in, and the community wanted a few board members to be there. And so we clearly delineated their role. And sure, there needs to be clear delineation of their role, because sometimes the community is asking for board members to be there because of their own peculiarities. Sometimes I don't want board members there, but you need to be clear about their roles, and they must stay in their lanes and be clear about that.
So I love if you can maybe expand a bit about, you know, what are some roles that the members of the board may have in terms of an affordable housing project, and then what roles would be more for staff?
Well, for us, it was really for staff. It was about the execution of what we were going to do in that supportive housing project. And then the board was there primarily to support what we said. And also, I believe the community that we engaged, they wanted to know that the staff had an engaged board and a present board. We were just not renegades primarily. So once they saw that, and we obviously, the board listened to what we said. You stay in your lane and we'll stay in our lane. We will be doing the execution of the work, and you're there as a support in a governance role. And the community that we engaged wanted to see that. So we made sure that that was an appearance in some of the community meetings. They weren't always present.
Yeah, I agree. If you're on a governance board, or your board is a governance board, it's oversight, it's advice, and it's kind of checks and balances. The board shouldn't be, in my view, the board shouldn't be tasking staff with work. And I think it's also important for board members to realize that if they do have requests from staff, that make sure that that request is something that you actually need and make sure you're giving the staff time to do it. I think everyone probably on this call knows what it feels like to have to drop everything on a whim sometimes to create something for a board member who's asked something and you need their buy-in, and that other things get dropped, other important priorities get dropped. So if the board is asking for something, they should know why they need to have that information. And in terms of what their roles should be in housing, I mean, I don't work in the housing space, so my answers are always going to be very much more general. But again, it's that governance, it's that oversight, it's removing barriers. If your staff is coming up against a barrier, that should be your goal, to try to help the staff and the organization complete its mission and complete its project.
Helen?
Yeah, I just had a bit of a follow-up question, if that's all right. I was really curious to hear maybe from Diane specifically, if there's ever a dynamic where there's a disconnect maybe between the staff on the ground who are working on the ground, like in a supportive housing site, working with clients, and versus maybe the view that the board might have of how things should be run, compared to people who are doing it on the ground, and if that ever in your experience has been an issue, or how folks who are leading organizations that are doing that work can mitigate that.
I'm just thinking if we have, I think we might have had one occurrence where yeah, I think we might have had one. And this particular board member was not very seasoned, and we had to school her, basically. Basically, she sort of overstepped the boundaries, and we had to inform her that she needed to stay in her lane.
Yeah, that's strong leadership, right, Diane?
Yes. I mean, I'm not going to beat around the bush. We have clear roles.
Mhm.
I have a governance board. It's not a working board. And this particular board member thought she had the right, and she saw an opportunity to become a staff member. So I did it in a very respectful manner, but I had to clearly state to her that we both have different roles. And whilst she is interested in certain aspects, and I can inform her about what she's interested in, but she needs to stay in her lane. Obviously, I was perhaps a bit more diplomatic because she's my boss.
Mhm.
And I mean, sorry, Helen, mine won't be a specific answer to that, but I think that there's so much power in those moments of conflict when the board wants to do something one way and the frontline staff is saying this isn't going to work. I don't know, people tend to kind of not enjoy conflict. I think that that's such a great opportunity. I think I am a full believer that staff should have access to the board when and if they need. So have that conversation. Where is that misalignment coming from? You know, but of course you have to have respect. The board has to respect the staff and their knowledge and their experience, and the staff has to respect the board and their knowledge and experience that they bring. So if you have that, I think that you can have a really meaningful conversation. It's difficult to achieve, but I think honest conversation and listening are keys to so many solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so those conversations being key and understanding the roles, these policies and financial governance of the roles of the board in that is difference between different organizations, but across the board. I would love to hear what is your advice for how staff and leadership can effectively work with the boards to ensure that the policies and financial governance of the institution reflects the mission of the organization and reflects also client needs.
For me, it comes back to centering the mission anytime you're making a decision. So in centering the mission, but also understanding why you're making the decisions you're making. Is it a financial constraint that you're deciding we can't do this right now? Is it a staff resourcing not available? And I think conflict arises when each party doesn't understand the position the other person's coming from. I feel like maybe I've lost the thread a little bit of your question, but I apologize if that's the case.
Okay, Cheryl, could you repeat the question again?
How do you ensure that staff and leadership are able to work collaboratively with the board to keep policies and financial strategies in line with the mission and with client needs?
Well, it's conversations, and I think it's continuously checking in with each other. And I'm lucky to have a really good board. I've certainly been in situations where I haven't had really supportive boards, but I happen to enjoy one now, so yay. So it's just having the conversation, and if there's something that's misaligned or out of whack, we are able to respectfully address it and correct course.
I think it's also too like putting ideas. So for example, affordable housing project that costs a lot and potentially could have cost overruns, acknowledging that those cost overruns are probably going to happen, but also deciding like what is the breaking point and having that clearly determined ahead of time, so there's no surprises. So if the board eventually says, you know, we can't do this anymore, that's not a surprise to the staff. We've reached the cost. This is our cutoff cost, and we need to take a break. We need to refund.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have our last question of the panel. I thank you both so much for your wonderful responses. This question here is, depending on the makeup of the board, how much of that conflict is related to power dynamics or coming from different professional backgrounds?
I think I disagree with the premise of that question. I think that's assuming that people who are not like each other will have conflict, and I don't think we should assume that. I think assuming that comes from a defensive standpoint already. I think that's my. I wouldn't assume that because they come from different sectors, they're gonna disagree.
Mm.
I think I've certainly experienced that. And I think strong leadership in terms of, and it's never an entire board, it's always one or two individuals. And I think leadership has to be strong to sort of sit that person down and correct course. And I don't really dilly-dally around those issues. And it's just the way I do things. It's my methodology. When I see that, I address it immediately and I address it head on. And I'm not going to be mealy around, I just hit it. And we've had board members who've come on board primarily to exert power. And I have no time for that, especially my personality. So I address it immediately, head on.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times when that board member may quit, or we end up having a bigger discussion. And that's also fine as well.
Mm-hmm. So what's coming through from your experience, Diane, is also the leadership of the executive director, right? Like self-care, we've talked about that, but being resilient and not being unafraid of conflict, and also being able to engage with people of different opinions, with even conflicting opinions, and keep course, right? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again, Joanna, Diane, for your time on this panel. It's been really an illuminating experience for me to hear from your stories and your experiences of how to develop board buy-in. So this is the first of our series of racial justice in real estate. We have a panel coming up next week and another coming up the following week. So, you can find the link to register where you found this one. The next webinar is on development finance in 2023, and the following one is on empowering experience of how being on a board transforms and propels the careers of real estate professionals. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.